Hello, and welcome to week 12 of my D&D diary. This week, my players run into Queen Bee and her apple orchids. They end up taking a few apples before they realize it's actually her orchid. And she gets fairly upset with them, but luckily Stephen is there to calm them down, because Stephen is a peddler and he's already interacted with the characters before and he knows that they're good. Stephen also gives them some quality brand honey as a show of good faith. My players decide to follow the road that leads them to Rithmere, the capital of the Lapis territory. Once in Rithmere, they make it through the hustle bustle of the city, and they run into this man who gets a bird to spin a wheel for them to win a prize. And one of my players decides he's going to give it a go, and he ends up winning a couple of wooden birds. They continue on to eventually make it to the Champions Inn. Anyone that is in Rithmere at this time is aware that the Rithmere Games is about to begin. There's posters everywhere, there's just a general buzz of excitement, and there's a lot more people in Rithmere than there normally would be just to come and see the games. So my players go to the Champions Inn and they talk to Mother Brightly, who asks them if they would like to join the games. Finalists in the Rithmere Games win themselves 100 gold, and the champion of the Rithmere Games gets a good 1,000 gold. Now, in D&D metagame terms, 1,000 gold isn't really a lot. I've changed the value of the currency in my game so that it lines up better with the books. So when I'm using prices from the player's handbook, I usually divide them by about 10. Now that they've joined the games, they get to stay in the Champions Inn and wait for a couple of days before the matches start. And this is where they meet Caleb, who is the new character of the player who had his character die last game. Caleb is a Broomfolk Fury barbarian, and he's perfectly suited for the games. And he's also secretly aligned with the Deltoran resistance. He's actually here as part of a coordinated effort by Doom to look into the nefarious goings-on that surround the games. So the games are one-on-one martial combat. In the books there's 3 categories. There's strength, speed, and cunning. For the sake of adapting it to D&D 5th edition, I decided to make it 4 categories, and they are as follows: magic, dexterity, strength, and cunning. Because I feel like those are better ways of fitting classes in the D&D universe into the games. And also in the books, they have to fight hand to hand, but in my version I changed it so that they fight with their weapons, and when they go down they have healers on hand to come and heal the downed competitors. I only made my players play 2 fights to get into the finalists, even though they probably would fight a lot more very weak opponents. My players are currently 4th level, and I made them fight a CR 1/4 NPC and then a CR 2 NPC. And I let my other players who weren't playing play as their opponents. Normally one-on-one D&D combat is fairly boring, but I made just a few tweaks to it so that it would be more interesting for everyone watching. You roll initiative every single round, and this is one that Matt Coville talked about when he was describing when he had to do a one-on-one combat. The second change is if you miss with a melee attack, your opponent can use
their reaction to retaliate with a melee attack of their own.
The third one is you can forego your action on a turn to gain advantage on initiative. And of course, I made the ring sufficiently big enough so that they can't run up to someone else and lock them in place in the first round, unless they're my monk player who has taken mobile and now has a movement speed of 50, so can sprint up to 100 feet. The other thing that is super important to these games is Queen Bee Cider. Queen Bee Cider is an alcoholic beverage that invigorates whoever drinks it. In the mechanics of the game, I said, if you drink Queen Bee Cider, you get advantage on all attack rolls for the next hour. This means that players are more likely to hit and fights go quicker, and missing an attack gives them an opportunity attack, which is super duper bad. So the likelihood of them missing an attack is lower and then more exciting when it happens. Also, potentially Doom might attempt to poison some of the players by dropping some sleeping potion into their Queen Bee Ciders, but that won't happen until next week. We ended the session after the first day of combat all my players became finalists because it's more fun that way. In my Tomb of Annihilation game this week, my players had just made it to Nagolore. They fly in and avoid most of the gardens, opting to go straight for the temple. They walk in, notice that the temple is mainly empty except for a giant statue, and they continue through to the pool behind the temple. In the pool, there's some dismantled statues that are described as lifelike. As soon as you describe a statue as lifelike, players are like, oh boy, it's a Medusa. While they're poking around, they end up making it to Zalcore's lair. They crack open the door and they peer in, and Zalcore is there sitting on her bed. An ancient disgraced queen of Cholt. She has a veil over her face because she doesn't wish to show it to anyone but her champion. There's this whole tragic backstory in the book about how Zalcor and Tycho Thera have this tragic relationship, and Tycho Thera dies. Zalcor isn't inherently hostile, but she will be aggravated if players tried to take the Black Orchid from her, or if they mess with Tycho Thera's ashes. There's also a Black Orchid next to her, which my players correctly assume is very useful as a material component for types of spells and that type of thing. They ask about it, but ultimately decide they don't have enough to be able to pay for it legitimately. They leave Zalcor and they go back into the temple, and that's when Ajan becomes interested in a clay pot, and he goes over to it and he touches it. The Iblis outside notice and they start screeching for Zalcor to come and to kill these guys. But when Zalcor rocks up, they fly off into the sky. They decide that they want to head back to the heart of Ubatu, and they start trekking through the jungle. They end up fighting some ghouls and being caught by some assassin vines, and they make it across the Oolong River again. And that's where we ended the session with those two players. I have another two players playing in the same campaign, but we didn't get a chance to play for the last 3 weeks. Those players are picking up where they left off, which is 3 weeks behind where my other current players are. When they left off, they were camping out under the heart of Ubatu. Aura, the Asima champion fighter, is asleep, and in her dreams she is met by a devil who is claiming to be her father and is claiming to be Asmodeus. Asmodeus asks Aura to go and retrieve the ruby rod of Asmodeus and gives her the directions in her mind. He can't get it himself because he's not allowed to leave Bator, and he's asking it of her because she's his closest offspring, or whatever. She bargains with Asmodeus and signs a contract for her to go and retrieve the ruby rod for him, in exchange for him bringing an end to the race of Asima. She sees creatures like herself as a blight on the world and would quite like to see them all destroyed. He writes up a contract and she signs it. And then she is woken up by her good old pal Hethridar, because meanwhile a hag shows up to the camp. Peggy Dumbbells shows up and steals the dwarven barbarian Torb in his sleep. The auntie sorcerer who is on watch decides, no, I'm not going to let this hag steal my friend, and she puts up a really valiant fight. But in the end, the hag dispels the whole person that she had on Torb. Torb runs off into the jungle and she steps into the ethereal plane to escape. So then the players decide they're going to head in the direction that Asmodeus told to Aura. For the sake of haste, and with those players I feel like they're less inclined to enjoy the jungle travel part of the adventure as much, I decided to cut out the jungle travel. They travel for 3 or 4 days through the jungle until they are approached by a group of grungs. Grungs don't speak common, but to make it easier on my players and myself, I decided grungs can speak common, but like really, really badly. So they're approached by some grungs and they're like, help us, King needs needs to be killed, please. And that's where we ended that session, with them agreeing to help the Grungs rid themselves of their rulers. Now, in the Curse of Strahd campaign, so last session we just made it back to the inn, and also last session, Valakai had just been absolutely massacred by vampires that we let out ourselves unknowingly. We realize that tomorrow there will be a power change. Either the Burgermeister decides to take action on the Watcher's house, or the Watchers take action on the Burgermeisters. So we decide to head to the Burgermeister's to see if he can be of any aid to us, and whether or not we want to help him control Valakai or help him lose control of Valakai. So we head over, and the first rule that we all agreed on was there's no fighting. We're just going in, we're going to talk to him, and then we're going to leave. We make it to the front gate. We knock on the knocker, and a man opens the door. He is a big, grizzled man with a large demon arm. It's his left arm, specifically, and even more specifically, we know that he is Isik, the captain of the guard, and also the man who killed my father. I am cordial with him. I ask, do you know Iathan by chance? And he says, yes, I know he died like a bitch. So I'm a little bit taken back. And so I draw my rapier and I say, hello, my name is José San Diego. You killed my father. Prepare to die. And he's like, look, can we take this outside? The DM made us roll initiative. I ended up about middle in the initiative order, and most of the people in the party decided to hold off their attacks until I did something or Isik did something. But then Isik decides to walk outside, and that gave the Warlock, I think he has the Warcaster feat, so he used it to attack him with an Eldritch Blast in the back of the head. And Isik just toughs it and keeps walking. And then in the next initiative round, the Barbarian goes over and attacks Isik. He misses, but Isik retaliates by attacking him back. And for me, that was enough. I was like, that's it. I ran in and I ran past him and then turned around and stabbed him in the back of the leg. I ended up getting a critical hit and I had sneak attack. I did like 35 points of damage to him. Since he has seemingly made a pact with the demon to regrow his arm, as he starts to die, he gets more and more powerful and begins to flame. And when I stabbed him in the back of the leg, he bursts into fire and I take a good amount of fire damage. I drop below half my hit points. I continue moving to get 15 feet away from him so that he has to fight me and only me. But I also realize I am very outmatched. If it hadn't been for the other party members, I probably would have died very quickly. The wizard decides to peace out. The job was to talk to the Burgermaster, not to fight Isik. So he goes invisible and goes and explores the house. The bard casts Phantasmal Force and succeeds and makes this illusion of many, many Josés dodging around Isik, stabbing him with illusionary rapiers. The Warlock makes the mistake of making himself look like José, ends up copping a fireball to the face, and not a fireball as in the spell, but he throws these balls of fire and it hit him right in the face. He goes down. Paladin picks him up, and after he gets picked up, he decides, what the hell? And he pops the cap of another one of the hag vials, this time youth, and he drinks it. And he goes back into the fray. But this time he loses 40 years of age. Now he just looks like a plucking young 20-year-old. Meanwhile, the Paladin, the Barbarian, and I are surrounding Isik. And for the most part, Isik has been pounding on the Barbarian. And so Barbarian didn't have a lot of health and ends up going down. I go down in the next round and I'm on death saving throws and I fail. And Isik doesn't have another action, but he does lift his axe and put it over me, ready to crush me on his next turn. The paladin comes in, and instead of using an attack, he decides to do a defensive buff. I think it's an Oath of the Defender, and the DM not wanting like 2 characters to die in like the one session, he gives the paladin an extra bonus when he casts this spell, and it uplifts all his allies who are like in the surrounding radius. So it uplifts the barbarian and it uplifts my character, and luckily it's our turns next in initiative, so the barbarian has an attack and does an extra bit of damage, and then on my turn I put my rapier to his throat and I say, offer me money. And Isik's like, what do you mean? I'm like, offer me power. And he's like, what for? I'm like, offer me anything I ask for. And he says, anything you want. And I'm like, I want my father back, you son of a bitch. And I stab him right to the stomach and he dies. And it was good. But then my character's sort of in this point now, he's completed his life goal, and so he kind of gets a little depressed for the rest of the session. While we were fighting Isik, the wizard snuck into the burgomaster's room and managed to put his dogs to sleep, and then had a chat with the burgomaster. It was cordial for a little while, but then the wizard snaps. He's like, you're no use to us, and he kills him. When we were done fighting Isik, we came up and we found the burgomaster dead, and the wizard's like, yeah, he was no use to us. And we searched the rest of the house, and we found that the burgomaster was probably a bad bloke. He had like people hung up in a closet where he'd go and beat them, and there's also a room that was filled with Irina dolls, like dolls that look like Irina. And there was also another room of note, which was in the attic, and it had these 3 mannequins of children and a teleportation circle, but the circle didn't work. We ended up taking the burgomaster's body and Isik's body and grabbing as many bodies as we could find from the street and burning them in a big pile. 1, to make sure that no one knew that we killed the burgomaster, and 2, to burn all the bodies to make sure they don't rise again as vampires. But yeah, that was this week. Have a good one.